Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Wine, Women, and Words. And with me, of course, is Michelle.
Hello.
And joining us this week is Elise Hooper to talk about her book that we've been talking about all month long, Learning to See.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, shall we just get into the book? I don't know. I might be the only one drinking tonight, it seems like.
I'm on the move. I do have a drink. It is not wine yet. I still have to pick up some kids and pack for a trip tomorrow morning. So, and I haven't had dinner yet. So I'm kind of, wine is still about an hour or two away from me.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll let you have the rain check.
For a little while.
Right.
And I'm upstairs I'm in New Jersey. I did a 13-hour car ride by myself with 2 kids yesterday.
Whoa. That's dangerous.
Basically, stumbled out of the car when we got there, and my aunt's like, "There's a glass of wine waiting for you inside."
Yeah, that would be essential at that point.
Oh my, that was probably the best glass of wine I've ever had in my life.
And a fantastic aunt who just gives it to you, knowing that you're going to need it.
Right.
So, but I had 2 glasses with dinner tonight, so I got a little. There's a time difference, so I'm just ahead of the game right now.
Good for you.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah. Well, the one that I've got tonight, I got a Riesling, and it's called Brethren of the Road, and I thought that was very fitting for the book.
Oh yeah, I love that. That's great.
Yeah. So, okay, well then, with that done, let's dive into it. So, what was it about Dorothea Lange that drew you to want to write a book about her?
Well, I had known of her work for so long. I've worked many years as an English and history high school teacher and had used her photography from the 1930s and even the early 40s in my classes when I was teaching things like the Grapes of Wrath or the Great Depression. And I was then researching these photographers here on the West Coast. I wanted to do a project that was closer to home after writing my book about the Alcotts. Mm-hmm. Which brought me, traveling all the time back and forth from Seattle to Boston. And I knew I needed to do something more local to me on the West Coast. So I was researching all these photographers, and then I just found this whole life of Dorothea's that I knew very little about that was just really intriguing to me. And I specifically wanted to better understand that transformation of the work to the work I really was familiar with, which is that sort of hard-hitting photography of the 1930s when she's looking at migrants and people on the streets and reconciling that with what had led her there from this successful portrait studio that she ran all through the 20s, kind of photographing the city's wealthy elite. I wanted to better understand that transformation in her work.
And that's really, I thought that kind of arc, not arch, in her life.
That works.
That arc was really interesting because she started out with, her goal was to be successful and be able to, take care of herself and build a successful business. And she created that for herself. But then in the process of building that life, she found what she was really meant to do. And I just thought that was really brave of her to have that inner strength to decide, no, this, yes, I have a nice life and I have what I wanted, but that's what I wanted isn't what I needed.
Right. I think that's a great way of putting it. Absolutely. She always was a little restless, even when she had this successful business going of this portrait studio in San Francisco. But you're right. She kind of itched for something more, I think something more meaningful that felt more meaningful to her, at least.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we go on any further, I want to warn any listeners out there that there will be spoilers. We're going to talk about the whole book from beginning to end because we got some stuff to unpack here. I've got some questions about Dorothea's life and the portrayal in the book that we just need to get down to. Yeah. For example, I think the first thing coming up, which I don't think you and Michelle and I have not had a chance to discuss yet, but the whole leaving her kids, that contradiction. I've been dying to discuss this. I mean, she's abandoned when she's a child by her father, and then she goes and abandons her kids into a foster home. I mean, what was that like for you, discovering that she did that and writing that and trying to get her thought process out there as to why she did this?
Well, I think that is honestly one of the really interesting tensions in the novel. And I think the other part of it is that she's best known for photographing families. So
Yeah.
I think all of that makes for a really compelling, kind of fraught storyline. And to be honest, I really think when we look at Dorothea and what she struggled with, she provides a really interesting kind of time capsule into women's lives in the 20s and 30s and beyond, really, even. But certainly a woman who had ambitions beyond marriage and raising children. I mean, that how she was supposed to balance that with her family life, she had no support. And the other thing I think is, I mean, she would bristle against any description of her abandoning her children, because there were people truly taking children to orphanages and hoping, sort of walking away and hoping their children would find a better life with someone else. And that was not what Dorothea saw herself doing. In fact, she saw this as a much better alternative. So, you know, there weren't a whole lot of options for her, especially in the beginning. You know, she's married to a guy. There's never talk of him looking after the children. That just wouldn't have occurred to anyone back then, even though his work was not selling, and they had rent to pay. I mean, the bills were mounting, and she was the one who could make some money. So I think she saw herself as doing what she needed to do to best serve her family and best serve her work, which her work, she would have argued, was supporting her family. You know, I think this is also something that's really easy for us to write off as being something that is very firmly in the rearview mirror of American life. Some, you know, women now have a lot more options. And I can tell you right now that from my experience being a high school teacher, many families don't have other options. I mean, I used to have students who would miss school regularly. I mean, multiple times a week. And when I finally tracked them down and asked them why, it was because they were home watching their younger brothers and sisters while their mom worked a day shift and a night shift, and there was no dad in the picture. And so I think that it's really easy, especially if you're in a certain class, social class, economic class today, to kind of be judgmental of what she did and what people even continue to do to try to keep their families together. But I think it's much more complicated than maybe it seems at first blush.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And you do bring up a really good point. Like, I remember reading an article, I think it was about a year ago now, where a woman was arrested for child endangerment because she left her kid in the car while she went and worked her shift at McDonald's. Because she had no other means to be able to take care of the kid. So yeah, that's a really great point in there. Now, one thing I always like to ask historical fiction authors who do books focused on one woman is, talk to us about putting that thought process. Because I mean, we talked about like the leaving the children with the foster parents while she took care of the family. How do you separate your ideas and your generational bias from somebody from this period? And even looking at like the other Alcott, you know, which is further back in time. How do you separate and find her voice within her constraints?
Right. Well, I spent a lot of time researching the era and reading interviews with other women or the figures themselves. Dorothea Lange didn't leave behind a big collection of letters or a journal or anything like that. What you get from her is mostly her photographs, and she did do an oral history with the University of California. There's a documentary that interviews her a bit called Grab a Hunk of Lightning. But I really try to place these characters within the limitations of their era and within kind of the general understandings of their era. Like, I make a big point of not having Dorothea kind of angry with Maynard for not looking after their children or offering to, because that never entered their consideration set in the 30s. So the last thing I wanted to do was sort of apply maybe what my husband and I would do in that situation today. So so I really just try to stay very truthful to the sort of the morals and ways of doing things from the time period in which I'm writing about, the time period in which I'm writing about, not in which I'm writing.
And that's one of the episodes earlier when we were talking about the book, we kind of touched on, it sounded from when her first child was born, it sounded like she was suffering from postpartum depression, where she, you know, I don't know if it ever, you know, if it would have been diagnosed like as that, but just like the not having the energy to get up or the will to get up and interact with her child. And that's, we kind of had that discussion about taking modern, you know, our knowledge and our viewpoints on everything and putting and applying that to the setting where she wouldn't have known what you know, what that was, or that that meant anything. But it's really interesting to just kind of see the evolution of motherhood and how it's taken and how it's approached from different generations.
Right.
Where back then it was just get up and, you know, and do it and deal with it. And, you know, there wasn't the network of support that mothers have now to be able to say, this is what's wrong. It's normal. It's okay. It's, you know, it's not you. But it also, I think it shows how strong, I mean, women, not that women aren't strong now, or, you know, not that women weren't before her, but it takes a lot of strength for a woman to, you know, get up and just keep going, especially when, like you mentioned, it would never have entered her mind to tell Maynard to come home and cook a few meals himself, you know?
And I will say, there was never anything in my research that led me to believe that Dorothea had any bouts of postpartum depression, except, so that was a bit of my own fictionalizing there. I was trying to show really also the bond that she had cultivated over the years with Imogen, and sort of how Dorothea is really isolated on the West Coast. She's far from her family. And so she needed that friend, that female friend, to step in, a friend who was a little more experienced, had had 3 children of her own, to kind of cultivate that support network. But what I will say is that there were a few places in which I read that Dorothea did sort of struggle initially with figuring out motherhood. She had felt like a young mother, and without having her own mother nearby or any sisters or anything, she was a bit at loose ends. And she was kind of afraid of her own children at first. I mean, that line about that Maynard says something like, they're just like a puppy, just go ahead and pick them up like that. I read somewhere in an interview with someone that he actually had said something like that. And that just hit me because, you know, I think, again, to your point, you know, moms join new mothers groups, or there are all kinds of online resources for mothers to kind of maybe address that anxiety they may have about what to do with this tiny, precious little newborn. But Dorothea didn't have any of that. And I really was trying to show that she was trying to forge her own way as best she could.
Well, I think that you definitely successfully portrayed that, because and it's true. It's so, I mean, the first newborn I ever held in my life was my daughter. And it's like, what do I do with this?
Yeah. I'm like, left for long stretches on my own. Yeah.
And it's,
you know, even just something that I'm watching right now is friends of mine who are younger, who the husband gets paternity leave. So you have a mom and the dad home with this firstborn at the same time. Like, that's something I can't relate to at all. Kind of to your point, I had to figure, I mean, I was left at home initially with that new baby for like 10-hour stretches, just good luck. And I mean, that was 2005. So Yeah, I mean, when you rewind it to the 1920s, you can see how it would be pretty overwhelming.
Right. And to not be able, I mean, like the pediatrician probably had my number memorized, and to see her
Right.
my number show up on speed dial and go, oh my God, what now?
Right. And if you didn't have anything like that, absolutely, it would be completely overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I'm definitely glad I didn't have to raise kids in.
Well, you know, that is another interesting point where I was with a group of readers recently and they pointed out, you know, parenting as a verb didn't exist until recently, right? I mean, people kind of went about their lives and their children were a part of it. All you have to do is read a book like Little House on the Prairie to see that really coming to life. I mean, this whole idea of this sort of active, hovering parenting that we tend to do now is a pretty recent invention. I mean, kids used to be plunked down in playpens and would spend hours there while their moms cooked 3 meals a day and tended to the house and everything. This whole idea of sitting on the floor and stimulating your baby and talking to them, that's kind of a new development in the history of child rearing.
Absolutely, yeah, and that helicopter parenting, it just even brings back the whole university admissions scandal that's happening now.
Parenting. I just read the New York Times is calling it snowplow parenting. Yeah.
Oh, snowplow parenting.
Yeah,
interesting.
So like, forget rid of hovering. Now you're just full on blasting.
Right. The last I knew was helicopter, but yeah, wow, we are really going through all the different automobiles.
Right.
What's next? Bulldoze parenting.
We're operating heavier and heavier machinery.
Right. Help with the heavy lifting. I know, it's true. There were no machines in Dorothea's age, right? It was like there weren't even tricycles to help with it. There was no such thing as a tricycle mother.
You know what? Maybe there was a tricycle mother and we just didn't get it recorded in history.
Right.
Somewhere in some like volume of undiscovered notes somewhere, someone has coined the 1920s version of helicopter.
Right. Well, I mean, the other interesting part about that is if you were of a certain social class, you wouldn't really have even raised your own children, right? You would have had a nanny or someone or a cadre of nannies who would have done that. So, and then if you were at the other end of the spectrum, you wouldn't have been worrying about your kids. They would have been working right alongside you. So, so this whole idea of childhood being kind of a precious time to savor and to cultivate learning and bonding, you know, the 1920s and 30s and were all about survival.
Absolutely. And then speaking of survival, I mean, I found her photography is obviously it's there's no argument that's some of the best in our history. Really, when we look at it. And I came across her photography actually through Grapes of Wrath with, and I'm so embarrassed, Steinbeck. For a moment there, I was blanking on his name. So embarrassed because I love the Grapes of Wrath, but I discovered it through that. And I don't know why, but for some reason in my head, since I was in high school, I got this idea that like they knew each other. Like you think that celebrities all know each other, and then, or people within history would know each other. And then I was surprised by that part in the book where he wouldn't even, you know, he used her photos and he wouldn't even write a forward for her.
I know.
It was like, you asshole.
Right. I know. I mean, Dorothea did know a lot of famous people. There's no doubt about it. But yeah, Steinbeck, they never really met, it seems, face to face. And while he didn't necessarily select her photos to accompany his work, I mean, the San Francisco Chronicle and would have done that. But yeah, I mean, Dorothea was definitely pretty hurt that her work that had been linked to his writings so deeply, that he wouldn't help her out when she asked. That stung her. That by all accounts, that was upsetting to her, understandably.
Yeah, and I mean, even for me, having been a Steinbeck fan, I'm like, you know what? You've gone down a notch or two.
I know. That's the danger sometimes with writing these and certainly reading these types of books is some of those people maybe you've held up on pedestals or you've revered, you know, you realize they were human too and full of mistakes of their own. And
That's one of the things
It's
I
like
love about historical fiction is that you realize that these people that were in history were actually humans and
Yes.
they had similar emotions and feelings that you did.
Right. Right. Right.
it's like when you wouldn't talk about Fitzgerald or Hemingway for a while. You just had to.
Right.
Oh, seriously, I could not pick up a book about Fitzgerald after I read Z.
Yeah.
Yeah, after I read about Zelda, I was like, oh no, you were dead to me. I go through this stuff with history. I feel that way about Teddy Roosevelt right now. I'll tell you off air at least someday about my feelings about Teddy Roosevelt. But when you did the research, was there anything within her life that you found surprising that you weren't expecting?
I mean, to be honest, there were so many surprises. I almost wouldn't know where to start. One off the top of my head is that she became good friends with Frida Kahlo. Actually, some of the more intriguing surprises were about Ansel Adams to me. I hadn't realized, I had actually read a biography about his years ago when I lived in San Francisco, but I had sort of forgotten some of this, but that he was sort of a difficult figure in some ways. And certainly that the way their attitudes diverged on the issues of the Japanese internment, I thought were really interesting. The fact that whereas she was so appalled by what was happening, he didn't really have any big objections to it. So I thought that was pretty interesting that he was on, really kind of the wrong side of history when it came to the Japanese internment. Recently had a reader wonder, and I think I haven't pursued it, but I think he could be onto something here, but perhaps Ansel's eventual activism around the environment, maybe was that prompted by the criticism he sustained from Dorothea about the internment? I don't know. I think
it's a really good point.
Yeah, that's what I love about readers. They bring sometimes whole new understandings to things or great points for me to pursue. But yeah, I mean, so again, just so many surprises. I really had known so little about her life in the 1920s and her work as this successful portrait photographer. So that really provides such an interesting contrast to what comes later. And even just right to get to the beginning of the book, the fact that she and her friend Franzi were on this trip around the world and pickpocketed. I mean, that alone to me in 1918, how fascinating that two 22-year-old women were doing that.
Absolutely. And that was just, and so cool. And her bravery of like, well, you know what? I think I'm going to stay here. I'm going to make a life here.
Right.
I connected with that and I respected that so much. And I love that you brought up Frida Kahlo. The cameo that Frida makes within the book was so great. And I was expecting both. I mean, you kind of get that little bit of that skeezy, little bit of a hit on from the husband is what it felt like. And for part of me was almost expecting the same from Frida as well.
Yeah. I know. I kind of toyed with all of that. I won't lie.
Yeah, and you can kind of see her, that she recognized that this was a possibility too within her thinking, without so much coming out and saying, "Hey, this might happen."
Right.
But it was neat to see those bits of historic cameos that came through.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I forgot that Frida's husband painted a mural.
He painted several. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, they spent some good time in San Francisco. In fact, I was in Worcester, Mass. last week at the Worcester Art Museum giving a talk on the book, and they had sort of played it down of that they had some Dorothea Lange photos in the collection that they wanted to show me after my talk, and they took me down there, and not only, they just kind of kept pulling out Dorothea photographs, and then they were like, boy, we also have Imogen Cunningham. And they pulled out this gorgeous portrait that Imogen had done during that trip of Frida. So that was a real treat for me to get to see. I hadn't seen it live ever, so that was fun.
That's so cool. That is so very cool.
That's probably one of the most, I don't write historical fiction, but I love it. And the research side of it is like, that would be my jam right there. And to be able to see something face to face that you've been researching must be like a total nerd happy, like heaven.
It is. I'm so glad you recognize it as one of those nerdy highlights, because that's exactly what it is. I mean, I get so excited about that kind of thing. I really do. Like embarrassingly excited.
I know when you brought up the photos of like Imogen's portrait of Frida Kahlo, I was like, That sounds so. I was so jealous.
I
You
know.
you got to see that. So
I know.
Can I go see that too?
Yeah, you know what else was so cool was I just kind of said while I was there, I was like, gosh, and there's this awesome portrait of her done by Judy Dater. And they were like, oh, wait, we have that. And sure enough, they pulled it out. And I had tried to post that to Instagram and Facebook, but there is a nude model in it, a full frontal nude, and it was censored by, I mean, which is such a head scratcher to me, that in all the stuff that Instagram and Facebook allow to make it onto the internet, this beautiful photo of Judy Dater's doesn't make it in, but whatever.
Because it's actual art and not just something that somebody posted from their living room.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to. But I feel like in this book, it's also, as much, I love the whole working artist theme that was in here, because I can totally relate to that right now.
Right.
But I love the fact that it was almost like, in so many ways, a serenade to the artists of that day. Because, I mean, we've seen Dorothea's photos so often, especially the migrant mother. Though my favorite was from the internment camp with the Japanese kids holding the flag and saluting. That was, I think, that one's my personal favorite.
Yes.
But we get to see so many women in the arts in this that we don't really get to see. That I knew nothing of Imogen. Yeah. Before this.
Yeah. Imogen. I can hear my dog upstairs doing something weird. Yeah, I mean, I made a point of trying to include these women whenever I could, within reason, like in a way that served the story. A lot of women, a lot of peers of Dorothea's started photography just like she did, worked throughout their 20s, and then as they got married, they stopped. Dorothea and Imogen were really the two who persisted after marriage, but everyone else really did stop for the most part. So yeah, I tried at least to capitalize on a few years these women were producing photography, like Alva Levinson and some of I wanted to work their stories in to try to make them a part of the record.
Well, and I also really liked, I mean, beyond her life as an artist and what she did, I really thought that the female relationships played such a central role in the book. There were so many different dynamic relationships. You know, Franzi and her had, you know, a completely different relationship than she and Imogen did, and there were a lot of really complex components that play, you know, different friendships played to different strengths in everyone's personality.
Yeah, those friendships, I think you raise a really good point. Those friendships were definitely different, and they sort of served a different purpose within Dorothea's life, but they were so important. I think you're absolutely right, and that was definitely something I wanted to emphasize in the book. I mean, you know, husbands, well, certainly Paul Taylor was a real soulmate of Dorothea's in many, I mean, they were such a meeting of the minds when it came to work and so many things. But those women in Dorothea's life played such important roles. And women were kind of often the really reliable bolster when the relationships with the men weren't necessarily working out. In the case of Imogen's husband and Dorothea's first husband, they at the end of the day had their girlfriends to back them up.
What's that? Isn't that a Sex and the City quote that?
Oh, probably. I'd have
the girlfriends are. I'm butchering it, but it's something to the. Oh my gosh, words are not working with me tonight. It's something like, you know, what if our girlfriends are our real soulmates and are just there for whatever, for fun.
Right. That should have been the epigraph of my book. I missed the opportunity there.
That is definitely not the quote, and I know people out there who are listening who watch Sex and the City are yelling at me. But you know what quote I'm trying to say.
I do.
And I think you're pretty close. Yeah, something like that. No, but I mean, go ahead, Michelle. Sorry. No, you go. No.
I'm done with words.
You sure you're done with words? I don't want to just step all over you. And
No,
We're
for
being
now.
so polite with each other at the moment because we have company here. Now, you've done a number of events with, or some events with Dorothea's family. Is that correct?
No, I haven't
Okay.
done any official events with them. A couple of relatives have shown up at events I've done.
Okay.
And so, but I haven't done anything official with them.
Okay. What's that been like talking with her relatives?
It's been amazing. You know, I think I now have like a small glimpse into what it must be like when an actress plays sort of someone significant in a movie, like, you know, like Erin Brockovich or something. And I now understand whenever I read interviews with some of these actresses and they talk about being so nervous to meet the real people, I now have kind of a glimpse into what that must feel like, because I have been then sort of nervous when faced with these occasions, but in each time it's been great. I've gotten great validation from them and support, and so that has been tremendously gratifying, because I mean, of course, I respected, I developed so much respect for Dorothea over the course of working on this novel. At the same time, I could see that it's just a complicated dynamic all across the board with her family. And I really respected all of them. And I really understood where everyone was coming from in the position that they felt. So it is really powerful to meet someone who was there, who knew Dorothea, and to get their confirmation of what I had hoped to convey. That has been very rewarding.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's so cool.
That's really, and I like historical fiction books that, the book starts out when we first meet Dorothea. It's in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
So it's history, it's the past, but it's, a very close past.
Yeah.
To where, obviously her relatives are still alive. So you could actually, that's another like nerd out moment when you can talk to someone who knew, that would be another nerd out moment.
Absolutely. I know. It's been really exciting. Yes, for sure.
And I think the one thing we haven't touched on was the polio that she had as a child, and how that affected her both physically and mentally throughout the story. Do you think maybe that may have had a effect on how on her photography and how she tried to find and view people through the lens?
Absolutely. I think there's no doubt. I mean, even when I'm starting a story, when someone's in their early 20s, I'm definitely going back in my research to figure out those formative experiences, that shaped them and shaped their outlook on life. And for Dorothea, I think there are two that you just can't miss. The first being, yes, contracting polio at 7. I think definitely gave her a sense of being an outsider that she never really was able to kick her entire life. I think it took her a long time to make peace with that. And so I absolutely think you can't look at her work from the 30s and not see that part of Dorothea that felt a little different from everyone else, didn't feel part of the mainstream, maybe even felt a little unlovable. I think all of that shows in her work. I think she sought out people who were also feeling different and maybe a bit marginalized and unlovable at the time. I also read a few accounts by people saying that limp that she left her with is something that also made her very empathetic to her subject. So when she was in the fields or on the streets, people saw her coming and kind of saw something in her that they could relate to. And so that also made her easy to get people at their, to have them open up and be vulnerable with her. I think the second thing that can't be minimized at all is the fact that her father did leave when she was 12 and just vanished, never to be heard from Dorothy, never to be heard from again. I think that left Dorothea with a profound sense, again, I think, of being feeling potentially unlovable. also very empathetic with people who weren't fitting into this sort of American dream that we're being kind of sold at every turn. And I think it also gave her a real fascination with family, and also I think it explains why she continued with that first marriage, even though for so long it was so hard.
Mm-hmm.
I think she was really trying to hold her family together to kind of compensate for some of the loss she felt she had suffered as a kid. And so I think that those two formative experiences really play out in all of her own personal attitudes and certainly in what we see in her photography later. Absolutely.
And I remember, was it the scene where she remembered her father leaving and she actually saw him leave? Was that how it, were those the accounts?
Yeah.
Actually,
I don't know if she truly watched him walking down the sidewalk, but as a novelist, that is a very poignant scene to include. What my understanding is that he left and she never knew what became of him. What's interesting and what doesn't make it into the novel is that her first biographer set about figuring out what happened to him and discovered that he had left the family because of some legal problem and debt. What's interesting is that Dorothea's mother maintained a relationship with him for another 10 years, but she never told her children, which I think is so amazing. Also, not super surprising for that era, and for a few reasons. Number one, people held secrets like they don't anymore. I mean, no one went to therapy back then. So people, I mean, that's how we have these amazing stories kind of coming from this period, because people would hold on to secrets about family and children and all that kind of stuff. And you know, secrets make for interesting stories. And so, yes, Dorothea's mother held on to this. She didn't tell the children. And I think also why she did it was because part of the reason he left was to try to save his family from being associated with him. And so for her to separate herself from him, she needed to divorce him legally. And really the only way a woman could get a divorce at that time was through showing abandonment. So she took that so far that she never even told her children what had happened to him. I just think that's amazing. And the other part of it that's pretty crazy is that when that biographer, Milton Metzger, went to Dorothea's second husband and told him of his findings, Paul's response was, I never even knew Dorothea's father had left. Dorothea never even told the people most important to her that her own father had abandoned her.
How interesting.
Yeah.
And I wonder what his legal problems were that he had to leave the family.
Yeah, I don't really remember. I think it was mainly around debt. I'm not sure if he was embezzling or something, but he got himself into kind of a financial pickle, and I'd have to go back to my notes and kind of investigate. Yeah.
Now, did she even keep in touch with her mother and her brother?
Yes.
Okay.
She actually did. And that was something I just had to kind of smooth out in my novel for simplicity's sake. She did maintain a relationship with her mother. She visited with her several times. Both her mother came to the West Coast and Dorothea visited her in, like, especially later in life, in the Northeast. And Martin, Dorothea's younger brother, she also maintained a relationship with. In fact, he lived with Dorothea and Maynard and the boys for stretches when they were all in the Bay Area. At that point, I was sort of risking a lot of different characters and things like that. So I decided that he was going to get smoothed out of my narrative. But yes, Martin played a bigger role in the story than my novel would have you believe.
Yeah, I was curious about that, if she had just, you know, completely cut off ties to start off this new life, or if she kept in touch with them. But yeah, that's the thing about people's lives, is that they don't move in a smooth plot point when you go to make a book about them. Sometimes you have to kind of smooth things out and cut things out. No, you learn that when you start to write a historical fiction novel, especially one that's focused around somebody's life. You can't include everything. Otherwise, you have this 200,000 word tome that nobody's going to want to read, and plots are all over the place.
Well, you'd have a biography, basically.
Pretty much. And we don't read historical fiction to learn, per se. We read it to feel. That's my motto.
The high school teacher in me also likes to trick people into learning. So I feel like the best compliment I can get from a reader is when they tell me how much they enjoyed the book, but then they were led to do a bunch of research after, like they wanted to know more about these figures. To me, that is a huge compliment. I do love it when people tell me how much they learned through reading the book. That's a great bonus.
Yeah, and I mean, really, I was a fan of Dorothea before this. I was a fan of photography before this, but I never really got that full picture of her life. And I admire her even more now because of this book. And I do love, I think at the back of your, is it your about section in your thing? You actually put out the sources on where to look for it.
Oh yeah, I always include my sources. Yes.
Yes, just like now I get that combined with the whole English teacher thing. It all just comes together now.
Yeah,
it makes sense.
Yes,
I can't hide my roots. For sure.
You may leave the profession, but the profession never leaves you.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think books like this, I mean, you know the person, or you know of the person, you know their work, and you know you can recognize it and go, oh, that's from the Great Depression. But you know, sometimes you'll never go out and research and learn about the story unless, you know, it's really in your mind. But I think that's one of the things that's so great about historical fiction is it, like you said, it tricks you into learning. You all of a sudden you don't know the person behind the work of that you're so familiar with.
Right. Yeah. Well, I always learn so much writing these books. I mean, that is always a challenge for me, is to kind of really follow the story and not let so many of the interesting things I learned, like that whole thing about Dorothea's father, for example, really, you know, work its way into the book when it doesn't exactly serve the story. But I do learn so many great things that I would love to include. But yeah, some restraint is necessary to again build that story up.
It is so easy to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So easy. Well, we are just about at our time. Thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure reading this. And if you guys have not read it and you've stuck through all of the spoilers, shame on you, but yet go out and buy the book. That's going to be your punishment, is to go buy the book.
Thank you.
And then enjoy reading it. Because it really is an enjoyable read. It was an easy read. And I say that easy as in it was like nice, like sitting down conversationally. It wasn't too thick and too heavy.
Good.
It's a nice
it's a perfect like summer read, I think.
Good. All right. That's fair. I love hearing that. That's great.
Yes, this is definitely going to be in our summer reads recommendations.
Oh, thank you.
And then you guys go ahead and pick up our next book. Our April book of the month is Woman 99.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So you guys pick up that and read that if Michelle hasn't already started that yet, because it looks like she had.
I've had that sitting on my shelf for a while, and when I packed for this trip, because we're in Jersey for a week and then we're going to North Carolina, and you always have to decide what books you're bringing. You know,
yeah,
it's more important than the clothes.
Yeah.
So obviously, learning to see and Woman 99 were the first ones in the bag, and it's like, well, what else? Then you bring like 7 other books in case the other books that you're reading you don't like, or
you just get through things faster. I find myself I read so much while I'm on vacation.
But Woman 99, I was like, oh, I could probably start that, but I decided to wait.
Well, yeah, with me, we went to Costa Rica once, and we went to a hotel that had no internet, no television, and I had my Kindle. And I kid you not, I read a book a day while we were there over the course. My husband was out fishing, and I went from our patio to a hammock to the pool and then back to our patio the whole time reading a book. And I go over to where the one spot where they had the internet was, and I download a bunch of different books. I'm like, these are my souvenirs for the trip, and never again am I not going to bring enough books with me.
Absolutely. It's funny. I have spring break coming up, and I've been thinking, what am I bringing? And I use an e-reader typically when I'm traveling, just because I go through a lot of books when I'm reading, and I am not about to carry a big stack. However, I did just have a note come up from the library that Alan Brennert's new book, which I can't remember the title of, but it's set in Hawaii, is available to me. And I'm kind of like, oh boy, I think I'm going to bring an actual book.
Isn't it like Daughter of Molokai? Or
yeah, I think you're right. I loved his other books, and so I'm really excited to read this one. So I think for him, his book, I will make this concession of bringing an actual book on my trip with me. But normally, yeah, I try to, I mean, otherwise they would take over my luggage.
Exactly. I've got a camping trip coming up, and it's like, okay, we're going to have the camping essentials, and then I'm going to have the box of books for the camping trip. Just because. Yeah, I mean, I've got to unplug, so what do you expect me to do?
Right.
That is unplugging.
Right.
Exactly.
Good.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been really fun.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I love hearing that guests have fun with us.
Always. Yes.
Because we're not stuffy readers and interviewers. Not in the slightest.
No, great. Thank you so much for making the time and reading this book. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime.
All right, and we'll see you guys next week. I forget who our guest is next week, but we'll see you next week with a new guest.
Have fun. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.